Hello everyone, welcome to the video. Today we're going to be taking a look at a Daenerys Targaryen themed commander deck. The inspiration for this deck came as a way to introduce my mom to Magic the Gathering. She is really into a lot of nerdy things. She's a huge fan of role-playing games and tabletop games, but card games were never really her thing. So we tried a few times, didn't quite fit, and I figured that if we gave her something really special and really fun to play with, that might be the way that we get her in. So in order to do that, one of the things that we ended up coming about to was choosing a Game of Thrones or Song of Ice and Fire theme. I felt that the universe could meld well with the existing card pool that we had, and it would take just a few cool changes to make the deck really stand out. The first iteration of this deck came about as a Night King themed deck. However, when I pitched that to Mom, she was less inclined to be the bad guy, so we went back to the drawing board and ended up finding out that a Daenerys Targaryen deck would be a little bit more her style. Now, the next big challenge was figuring out which Magic the Gathering character would best represent our Daenerys Targaryen. Originally, I was thinking about maybe using some of our Sarkhan Planeswalkers and have them represent Dany at different stages throughout her life, showing her transformation from Princess into Mother of Dragons, into Breaker of Chains, etc. However, sticking to the true nature of Commander, I wanted to make sure that I had Planeswalkers that could truly be a Commander, or rather a legendary creature that I could play instead. So in evaluating our legendary creature card pool, we decided that Kenrith the Return King was probably the most viable Commander that we had on the table. Kenrith beat out competitors like Kali of the Vast, who would reduce casting costs on dragons as well as bringing them out with haste like quickness, and cards like the Dragon, who fit into Dragon Tribal and share his 5-color mana identity, but comes at a much steeper casting cost. The main reason for this choice came about due to Kenrith's accessible casting cost, as well as his range of abilities that allowed things like haste and trample on his creatures, constant card draw, and graveyard recursion. So now that we've picked our commander, let's build the deck. To best represent the Song of Ice and Fire, we are going to be adding a lot of politicking and royalty themes to our deck, so we're going to start that off with Will of the Council and Temptation-like cards, as well as adding a lot of cards that have to do with the Monarch mechanic. The final motif for the deck will be the inclusion of a lot of big red dragons. These will act as Dany's main form of attacking, and one of several win conditions that we have included in the deck. But before we start looking at those kinds of cards, let's first take a look at all the cards that we made some Vorthos changes to better fit the Daenerys theme of the deck. So we started off with Adriana, Captain of the Guard. At first I was pretty adamant about having her be a Brienne character because I think just the card already exists in such a way that it almost doesn't need any alteration and it works pretty well. However, to fit the Daenerys theme a little bit more, I ended up choosing Daario Naharis. So we ended up doing a little bit of a switcheroo for that one. I actually ended up making both of the proxies for this version in the final product. That way, Mom had the choice between which of the two characters she wanted represented at any given time in her deck. The next character we ended up altering was Baird, Steward of Argive, which we replaced with Barristan the Bold. This was a good example of another easy transition, very similar to Brienne and Adriana, who just really represented the character already, and that we had to do minimal changes with to have his card ability and his card theme kind of play well with Daenerys' theme. Now, just as with Baird, who we have in there as a form of protection for Daenerys, we're going to continue the theme with a few other mono-white creatures in our Vorthos switching. So the next one we're going to do is Protector of the Crown. We are going to switch out to Jorah, and this one I think is a really good choice because I think it fits the theme very well for Jorah. Like, I think it's very on brand for him. It is a little overcosted for what the ability of the card does, but this is one of those things that I think for the sake of the flavor of the deck, I would stick with this choice. Also, for some reason, I don't know, it just seems to me that Jorah would be the overcosted card in the deck. Like, he's good, he's a very loyal person, but at the same time, I kind of feel like, yeah, you know what, he's probably going to cost more mana than he's worth at the end of the day. We're going to continue this after Jorah as well with Orzhov Advocist, another form of, again, attack reduction on us, some ways to mitigate damage, and to play into the politicking theme that we're going to see in this deck. So we have Orzhov Advocist represented with Missandei, Loyal Advisor, and I think again it kind of fits that theme of the mono-white creatures, especially humans, that we have as different protectors for Dany and different people enabling certain abilities with that. Now, in terms of other cards in this deck that we have enabling Dany, we're going to find a lot of things in Temur colors. So the three kind of color sections that we have going in this deck right now are the mono red dragons. We have a small subsection of the white humans and creatures, and then we have a lot of teamer support. So in that regard, one of our first big characters is we're going to have Sarkhan in this deck, not as Dany and a Planeswalker, but we are going to get Khal Drogo represented with Drogo, Ruthless Rider, which I think, again, maybe not necessarily the easiest Vorthos thing to understand. I actually talked to my mom specifically about this card, and yeah, you know what? Khal Drogo never really actually created dragons, but as a good enabler and a good pairing when Dany is on board, this I think is a really just fun combination of cards to have out. And yeah, I mean, I think it's still, you know, if you can suspend your disbelief for the card game to have Ice and Fire in here, then I think this works totally fine for that. The next teamer colored card we're going to be adding is going to be Suruk Dragonclaw. We chose Grey Worm to represent Suruk here, and again, I think it's fairly on theme, a good military kind of leader, and I think he would definitely allow creatures to rush into battle and to get the upper hand, so I think this is a good fit as well. And now, if we're going to have this be a Daenerys Mother of Dragons deck, while we do have a lot of red dragons that I think are really cool and really fun to play with, I don't think it would quite work without Daenerys' 3 dragons themselves. So we have Darighaz reincarnated as Drogon Dread Returned. We have Karthus Tyrant of Jund as Rhaegal Emerald Wind. In place of Teneb the Harvester, we have Viserion Winged Might. Each of these picks, I think, kind of work with the existing lore of each dragon. With the case of Drogon, the choice of Darighaz came from the fact that in the books, he is often referred to, Drogon himself is referred to as Balerion reincarnated. So having him be Darighaz reincarnated, I think, was a nice little nod to that. Plus, I think it's just a really great ability to have in this deck. With Rhaegal, I think the choice came down to wanting to include Karthus right from the beginning because he is so good in Dragon Tribal, and I thought that Rhaegal was just a really excellent spot to put him. Another strong dragon alongside Drogon kind of works out nicely. For Teneb and the Viserion choice, I think that came down to kind of the idea that he is slightly smaller in stats than the other 2 dragons, which works out with the lore for Viserion, but also that of the 3 dragons in the books, Viserion is the one that's most associated with death, and there is some kind of allusion to that, but also the fact that in the TV show, well, you know, he is the one that ends up getting turned. So while this version is still the book version and still, you know, very much on Daenerys' side, there is kind of that little bit at play there with the graveyard and the death theme as well. A few other non-legendary creatures and spells we ended up changing the Vorthos on a bit include Dockside Extortionist, which originally I was kind of thinking maybe we do like a Tyrion character based off the TV show and how he ends up teaming up with Daenerys, but after some thinking I kind of didn't really want to pull too many characters that weren't necessarily supposed to play into Daenerys' story, so we ended up choosing kind of a fictional character, and we made Tyroshi Sellsword just to fit the theme better, as there are no goblins in Song of Ice and Fire. Additionally, we also changed out the Dragon Throne of Tarkir for Dragonstone Seed of Power. I was also considering putting the Iron Throne in this slot in some way, but felt that this kind of was a little bit more on brand for the Daenerys deck, as she has yet to actually claim the Iron Throne, but we want Dany sitting on a throne, so this is how we're going to do that. I had also considered putting something like the Throne of the High City in this spot instead of Dragon Throne of Tarkir, as it did fit with the Monarch theme. However, I just kind of felt that we didn't really need that land slot taken up with Throne, and that if we were going to have one throne in the deck, that Dragon Throne of Tarkir kind of had a little bit more impact on the game, and we already had enough other Monarch cards playing that I didn't really feel like that was a necessary addition to the overall support of the deck. And some of the last few cards that we made Targaryen tweaks to better fit the deck include Vertus's Maneuver, which we swapped out to just be Draconic Disposition. The effect is still the same, but we changed the artwork and the name to just better reflect the ability of the card. We also did something similar with Sarkhan's Triumph being the quintessential dragon tutor. However, with Sarkhan not being the star of this deck, we decided to make it more on brand for Daenerys, so that's where we got Born of Flame. We also included the enchantment No Mercy in this deck. This enchantment, I think, really lent itself to the Monarch theme, and all we had to do was give it a little Fire and Blood punch to make it feel at home in this deck. And finally, we also swapped out Marchesa's Decree to Queen's Decree to better represent itself in the Fire and Ice universe rather than just on the plane of Fiora. The next section we will take a look at is creature cards. This section is primarily composed of red dragons along with some support cards to play with existing themes. The first 3 cards we're going to be taking a look at are Gadrick the Crown Scourge, Rapacious Dragon, and Hellkite Tyrant. These 3 dragons focus on artifacts, but more specifically on treasure tokens. A lot of the cards in our deck will focus on creating treasure tokens as one of the win conditions for cards like Hellkite Tyrant, as well as some others you'll see later in the video. Next, we're going to include Hellkite Charger and Scourge of the Throne. These 2 cards will give us additional attack steps that we can use to fly in with our dragons yet again and deal tremendous damage to our opponents. Next, cards like Lathliss Dragon Queen and Skyline Despot will give us more token dragons out in the field. Additionally, Skyline Despot will continue our Monarch theme, and cards like Knights of the Black Rose will play in not only to the Monarch theme, but will also be a nice allusion to the Tyrells, specifically Loras, from the Song of Ice and Fire. Next, onto the damage dealers. We are going to have Drakuseth, Maw of Flames, Terror of the Peaks, and finally Siege Dragon, which may seem like a bit of an odd choice, but this was actually a choice I made after having worked on the Night King deck. That deck had a lot of walls, and one of its main mechanics is the creation of 2/2 black zombies. So this, I think, was a perfect juxtaposition to that, where it just had this perfect answer to those kinds of things coming out of that deck. So if you're ever to play the Night King deck versus the Daenerys deck, this would be a really cool card to have some interaction with that. The next section of the deck, Dragon's Trove, will focus on the artifacts in our deck, specifically the ramp. So we're going to start off with a copy of Arcane Signet, a copy of Chromatic Lantern for color fixing, and a copy of Soul Ring to make sure those larger dragons will be cast on time. As some additional ramp, we are also going to be including Dragon's Hoard as well as 2 of the Dragon Monuments from Tarkir. The colors we have chosen for the monuments are the Naya colors because these will enable not only all of our creatures but also our ramp spells as well. To continue our theme of Dragon Tribal, we are going to include a copy of Crucible of Fire. We are also going to include a copy of Dragon Speaker Shaman to reduce the casting cost of our dragons, as well as Herald's Horn for a similar effect, coupled with a bit of card advantage. Now, our commander can enable haste on our creatures with their ability, however if they are not on board, we will need an alternative. Cards like Dragon Tempest and Temur Ascendancy will help us out with that, and cards like Quicksilver Amulet will allow us to get them out without paying for their full casting cost. Next, we're going to include Disrupt Decorum and Deadly Designs. Both of these will pit the other players against one another and kind of have us at a position of power over them if it's played correctly. Additionally, Deadly Designs just kind of looks like it's right out of King's Landing, so I think it fits even better in here after that. Now, for some of that artifact and treasure payoff that we talked about earlier, we're going to include a copy of Smothering Tithe, both as a form of ramp, but also this will be another payoff for things like Revel in Riches and our earlier mentioned Hellkite Tyrant. So to add a little bit more fun and flavor to our artifacts, we are also going to include 2 different swords in this deck. The first is Sword of Dungeons and Dragons. This one I think plays off well with the tabletop theme that Mum already kind of is familiar with, as well as creating more dragons for us to play on the field. The second sword is Sword of Fire and Ice. This one not only works mechanically well in our deck, but also has a nice allusion to the Song of Ice and Fire universe. Our next section, Draconic Sorcery, will focus on the instants and sorceries in this deck. We are going to start off with a copy of Banefire and a copy of Spit Flame. Both of these cards lend themselves to the draconic nature of the deck and are good ways of dealing damage, with Spit Flame especially being able to recur anytime we cast a dragon. For targeted removal, we're going to have Return to Dust, Barrier Breach, and Casualties of War. All 3 of these are excellent forms of mostly artifact and enchantment removal, but Casualties of War has a nice modular nature to it that will allow us to target anything we need. And this card's artwork was another one of those that I thought just lent itself really well to the Ice and Fire Vorthos that we're going for, looking like something that could be right out of the Battle for the Blackwater. Some other removal we're going to be including in this deck will come in the form of board wipes like Cleansing Nova, Crux of Fate, and Blasphemous Act. For our player interaction cards, we're going to have removal in the form of Council's Judgment, card draw in the form of Plea for Power, and mana ramp in the form of Tempt with Discovery. This is especially important as, while it is a little overcosted, if you do only end up getting the one, chances are Tempt with Discovery will allow you to grab multiple lands, and they do not need to be basic lands. This is very important for our mana base because a lot of the lands that we run will not be basics. Since we are in Temur colors, we will also be running a copy of Genesis Ultimatum. This will allow us to put a lot of great permanents right onto the battlefield without needing any additional support. Furthermore, we are going to be adding a copy of Flawless Maneuver. This card will allow our creatures to survive during crucial combat moments, and we have the potential to be casting it for free. We will also be running a copy of Earthquake. This card will hit a lot of different creatures on the battlefield and will likely not affect us too negatively since most of our deck relies on dragons. If we're able to combo this card with one of our extra attack steps, we can do a devastating amount of damage in a single turn. We are also going to be including a copy of Fabricate. This card, along with Sarkhan's Triumph, represent the only two tutors that we will be running in the deck. Fabricate's inclusion is due mostly to the fact that we will need cards like Quicksilver Amulet on board as much as possible. Alternatively, this can also grab mana rocks early in the game to make sure that we are in the right colors we need to play the cards in our hand. Next, let's take a look at the sorcery-based ramp that we run in this deck. First, we're going to run a copy of Cultivate. This will allow us to get some of the basic lands from our deck out onto the battlefield. We don't have that many of each basic land, but this means we can grab what we need. The next card is Farseek. This, in my mind, is one of the two best ramp cards we have in the deck. Due to the fact that we are running 4 of the 5 Triomes, Farseek's land criteria are easily met, which means we can usually grab a Triome, and if not, we can always resort to a basic land or shock land. And my absolute favorite ramp inclusion in this deck would be Skyshroud Claim. This card only allows us to search for forests. However, with the Triomes again, this means we can pull cards like Endotha Triome and Ketria Triome in the same turn, effectively getting all 5 colors of mana available on board for next turn. Now, for the final section of this video, I will be discussing the lands. Many of the cards I have put in this section are based solely on what I have available, and additionally have a good balance of the mana colors that we need. I do think this mana base is playable, however I don't think it's optimized, and if you guys have any suggestions for cards I could look into that would greatly improve the performance of the deck, I am more than happy to hear them out. With that being said, let's begin. We're going to start off with our basic lands. We are going to run 2 basic forests, 2 basic islands, 2 basic plains, and 2 basic swamps. We are also going to run an additional 10 basic mountains, as most of our creatures are going to be in red. As mentioned earlier, we are also running 4 different Triomes as well as a variety of shocklands. Most of these shocklands can tap for red, with the exception of Breeding Pool and Temple Garden, which will allow us to get ramp, card draw, and creatures early in the game. After this, we are going to be taking a look at things like checklands and bondlands. These will help us fill in the mana gaps that our shocklands didn't. Finally, we will also be including a copy of Command Tower and 1 Haven of the Spirit Dragon. So for some closing remarks on the deck, I realized that it is not the most competitive version of the deck, and there are a lot of easy cards that could be swapped in here to make the deck more powerful. Things like Seedborn Muse, or things that would allow us to activate Kenrith's abilities on a more frequent basis. However, for who this deck is designed for and the environment in which it will be played most often, I do think this is an absolutely fine version of the deck. If there's any personal adjustments you would like to make to the deck, I would be more than happy to see how you brewed it and what kind of different personal taste that you added in your own deck. Stay tuned, as I will be uploading the Vorthos Altered Night King deck in the very near future. That's all for today, and remember to have a good one.